Okay, so let me make that. All right, so thanks. So thanks everybody for coming tonight. I'm Patrick Chanezon from Docker, and I guess many of you have heard the news at DockerCon. We just announced support for Kubernetes. So I'll be pretty short on the slides today. I just want to show you a few demos of what that looks like. Who among you have tried Docker for Mac or Docker for Windows with Kubernetes support already? Oh, a few, very good. So for the rest of you, if you're going to the Edge channel on Docker Store, when you're downloading Docker for Mac or Docker for Windows, today you get Kubernetes support as part of it. I'm just going to show you how it works. The other thing I'll talk about and I'll show you briefly is we're also adding Kubernetes support in Docker Enterprise Edition, and I'll show you a test instance of that. It's in private beta for now. So what that means for developers, the fact of having Kubernetes on your desktop is that instead of having to mess with Minikube and VirtualBox and all sorts of tools that you need to integrate, once you install Docker on your desktop, Kubernetes is just a checkbox. And when you're developing your application, you can still use the same Docker tools that you're used to, Docker to build your images, Docker Compose to assemble an application with multiple services. But then you can also try them to deploy them with the local Kubernetes instance. And actually, by default, Docker Stack Deploy is going to deploy it to Kubernetes. And for that, we're using an extension, a CRD, a Kubernetes CRD that the Docker team has developed that runs in Kubernetes and defines a new stack object in there. And so when I do a Docker Stack Deploy, it's going, the description is going there. And then that code is going to translate that into Kubernetes pods, services, and deployment descriptors. So that's in Docker Community Edition for developers on desktop. It's also in Docker Enterprise Edition. And in Enterprise Edition, it's also integrated with all the stuff we have for role-based access control and all that stuff. So let me show you a quick demo of that. So here I have a pretty recent version of Docker Edge release working. So let me show you what it is. So it's 1802. I think the update was yesterday or something like that. And here you can see that in addition to Engine, Compose, Machine, Notary, and Credentials Helper, we have a Kubernetes 182 that comes with it. So what does that mean? When I go there and I go in Preferences, here I have my usual preferences. You can see in advanced, I added a bit more memory for Kubernetes to run on my laptop. And now I have this new Kubernetes tab here. And getting Kubernetes is just a matter of clicking on that checkbox and it will enable Kubernetes. There's another option that allows you to see the system containers that Kubernetes is using. Personally, I like to see that, so I enable that. Once you do that, you have to wait, I don't remember, maybe 5–10 minutes, it depends. It's going to download all the Kubernetes 182 release containers, run them locally, integrate them, and you can see when it's green that Docker is running and Kubernetes is running. So what can I see that? Also, when you install Docker for Mac and Docker for Windows, now it's installing the latest kubectl command line or kubectl. I never know which way to pronounce it. So I'm just going to show you what it looks like. So if I go there, let me make that bigger. Slightly bigger. So if I do a cat of .kube config, you can see here that Docker for Mac created a kube config for me, or is adding a new cluster to my kube config if I had one already. So here you can see I have a new cluster that's called Docker for Desktop cluster. and I have the user that's defined for it with the certificate data for accessing it. So if I do a kubectl get nodes, sorry. The kubectl get nodes, I see that I have locally Kubernetes 182 cluster that's in ready status. And there's one nice thing that they added where if you're adding other clusters to your config file, Docker Formac is going to read them. I actually learned about that on Twitter today. And here in Kubernetes, you can switch between different clusters. I haven't tried it yet, but it should be able to switch you from your different clusters there. And here I'm logged in with my Docker ID, so I have access to all my organizations and repositories. My swarms, if I have created several swarms there, and all that. Okay, so let me show you what it looks like on the desktop to develop with Kubernetes. So here I'm just going to use the same application I'm using usually, which is it's a Java application that's called Spring Doge. That my friend Josh Long at Pivotal built. He's part of the Spring team. Let me show you. So Spring Doge is it's a Spring Boot application that has one Java service that serves an AngularJS UI, and then another API that's coded in Spring Boot. And so the AngularJS UI is talking to the API that's coded in Spring Boot, and the API is using a MongoDB service using MongoFS to store images and manipulate them. So basically the idea that I upload an image to the service in the UI will pass that to the API. The API is going to store that image in the MongoDB database, then it's going to modify it and store the resulting image in the database and serve it back to me once transformed. So there are two services, Spring Doge Web and Spring Doge Photo, the backend and the front end. And then I have a Docker Compose file for that. So I have several Compose files here. This one I used in other talks is one where I Dockerized the whole Spring Tool suite to let me run the IDE in a container by proxying the X11 socket. So I have that documented on my GitHub. I won't show that today. But you can develop with your classic STS on your desktop. And you can debug in a Docker container from the Java IDE. There are some instructions on our website for how to do that. Once I'm done developing, I use a compose file like this, where I have built my image with a Spring Doge content. Actually, let me show you the Docker file for it. It's in Spring Doge. Where did I put my there? Oh, Docker file. Yeah, so my Docker file is pretty simple. It's using like an image that has Maven and the GDK. Actually, I need to update that because right now you should use instead a multi-stage build. So you use one image that has Maven to compile the resulting main jar, and then you use a second image to run it with just GDK. And here I'm just compiling my jar. I copy it from when it's been. Oh, actually, it's a multi. Oh no, sorry. So it's a multi-stage build. Actually, let me show it to you in an editor. It will be clearer. It's weird. I don't find it. Oh, Docker file, it's here. Yeah. Sorry. So this is actually a multi-stage build. So I have I have a first image where I'm using the Maven image as builder. And there, what I do is that I copy all my source file into the container, and then I do a Maven package in there. So it's going to download everything and do my build. And then in the second image that just has OpenJDK, there I'm copying the jar that has been built in the first step into the container image that's going to be there at the end. I set the working directory, and then it's just a Java -jar of the Spring Dot jar. And here I need the MongoDB URI parameter in order for my service to be able to connect to the database. And here I added a health check that's used if you're using a swarm mode. So I have my Docker Compose file there where I use the image that I built over there with the port mapping. The MongoDB URI is MongoDB to Mongo, and Mongo is the name of the service where I'm just running the Mongo image. In production, you would need to attach a volume to that in order for Mongo to store its data. And so here, when I run a Docker stack deploy, so I do a Docker stack deploy with the -- compose file to the Docker compose file that I just showed you, and I call my stack Doge. So when I do that, actually by default, what Docker is doing is that it's talking to the local Kubernetes cluster, and you can change the orchestration to say I prefer to have swarm mode, but by default it's using Kubernetes. And there it's going to talk to that CRDT, which is translating the stack into Kubernetes deployments. So if I go kubectl get all, I should see here that I have my Mongo service that's in there. I have my web service that's over there as well. And you will see something there, and I have my pods. So I have my Mongo pod and my web pod there who are running already. I have my deployments there, and I have my replica sets for them. So basically, the extension is creating all these objects from Kubernetes for you. So the only thing you need to do is just to create the compose file. But if you'd prefer to use Kubernetes native deployment descriptors, you can do that as well, and you can use kubectl to deploy them. One other thing I wanted to show you is this load balancer there. By default, it just detected that I mapped my port 8080 to 8080 inside of the container. So if I were using the classic Docker with swarm mode, it would automatically expose 8080 on the local host, so on the host of the kube cluster. In Kubernetes, what that means is that it's creating a load balancer that's published outside, which means on localhost here, with the integration that Docker for Mac has with the local network on port 8080 mapped to the internal port there. So if I go on localhost 8080, I should see my app running. By now it should have started. So I just go on localhost 8080, and boom, my application has started. And you can see that it works. If I take, I don't know, let's take an image from my desktop. Screenshot, for example, it's just taking that screenshot, and it's adding a bunch of things on top of it. So the app is working. Now, once I'm done with the app, I can start deploying it to production. So for production, we have a Docker Enterprise Edition. So this is a playground that we created that's not open to everybody yet. But that will be pretty soon, where you can play with Docker Enterprise Edition. So here you can see that for an hour, it gives me access to a Docker installation with 1 manager and 3 workers. So here I I'm logged into one of the worker. I can see the containers that are running there. And if I click on UCP, I end up into a Docker Enterprise Edition Universal Control Plane where I can see what's happening in my cluster. I can manage users and teams. I can even go to the admin console, and there in my profile, I'm able to download a client bundle. So I ask it to generate a client bundle. It's going to create that that zip file here. And if I look inside of the zip file, what I see there is that I have my environment variables that are set with the right certificates for Docker to work. But I have also that kubi.yaml. And that kubi.yaml is actually something that you can just paste in your configuration to be able to use kubectl to target the kube cluster running in Docker Enterprise Edition. So let's see what we have in there. We have, so typically in Docker Enterprise Edition, you were managing things like containers, images, and nodes. These exist as well in Kubernetes, so we call them shared resources. And then we have a Swarm tab, where you have Swarm services, volumes, networks, and secrets. These are Swarm concepts. And there you have the Kubernetes notions, like you can create namespaces. So by default, I have the default one. I have kube public for services I want to expose outside, and kube system for the system services of Kubernetes, but you can create your own. We have controllers. So there's nothing for now. There's one load balancer for Kubernetes itself. Here I could see my pods, my config maps, and storage. So basically the objects of the Kubernetes API are exposed in there, and I can manipulate them here directly. Where it's interesting is when I go to these shared resources, here I have stacks. And stacks is what you use to do a Docker stack deploy. These are compose files. And typically, traditionally in Docker, you could just paste a stack file and just deploy it as a set of Swarm services. But here, when I do a create stack, I have new options there. So I'm going to deploy a stack called Doge, and I'm just going to paste my compose file. Actually, it's there. I'm just going to take that. So I paste my compose file in there. Let me make that a bit bigger. And in there, there's an option where I can say, I want Swarm services. So that was the default before. Basic containers is the classic Swarm, the old Swarm mode. And then I have Kubernetes workloads. And so when I select Kubernetes workloads, I need to select additionally a namespace where I want them to run. So here I'm just going to run them in the default namespace. And when I click create, if I click on that object, I will see the object, the CRD object that it has created based on my compose file. But when I go down to containers, here you can see that I have Postgres, Notary. So for now, it hasn't started yet. But if I go in there in pods, yeah, so in pods here, you can see I have a web pod and a Mongo pod. So these are the pods that have been created based on my deployment descriptor. When I go to, and then if I go to containers, I should be able now to see the, oh yeah, so now it has started containers based on these pods. And if I go in these containers, I have the same kind of facilities I always had in Docker Enterprise Edition, where I can view the logs for these pods. So I'm seeing it starting. I can stop them. I can eventually launch a console into one of the pods or start and stop them. So here I have all my images. So in terms of load balancers, now I have a load balancer for Mongo and for the web one. And then let's take a look at this. I don't think I have created any configuration in there. So if I go in there in the web load balancer, I can click on there. Oops, no. So it hasn't started yet, so it's not operational yet. But if I click on that later, I should be able to see my, just keep it in there. I should be able to see my application started based on Docker E there. So that's kind of the end-to-end cycle from desktop to production using Kubernetes and Docker. Now I wanted to show you just a few things, a few pretty cool things that you could do now that you have a local Kubernetes cluster on your machine. So the first thing is Kubernetes itself is coming with a UI that's called the dashboard, but you need to install it. So I've done, it takes 5 minutes or something, so I've done it before, but I just wanted to show you that installing it is just a kube apply of that dashboard file, YAML file, and then you need to create a role for it. Once you've created that, you need to do, so it's not exposed by default to the outside, so you need to launch kube proxy. Where is my kube proxy? Yeah, so here I'm running kube proxy on port 8000, which means that now if I go to, so here I'm going to, so once I'm running kube proxy, I can go to localhost 8001, and kube proxy is going to expose all the internal services that are running in my cluster through that. So the syntax there is that you pick your namespace. So here, the dashboard is running in the kube system namespace. And then you have services, and then you specify the protocol, the name of the service, and then /proxy. So here, since I have created, normally there are many ways that you can authentify to the dashboard, but if you create the user as I've done before, you just can say skip. And here you end up with seeing everything in your cluster. So here I can see all the stuff that's running, the web container that I have created before, or the web, actually it's, I think it's a pod. The Mongo, no, these are containers. Oh no, these are deployments. So all my deployments, the web and Mongo deployments, my pods, my replica sets, my services, etc., even some secrets. And I can browse all that in there and go into more details for each of them. So for example, let's take a look at the web one. I can see the labels that are associated to that. Then I can dig into the pod itself, and I can see the environment variable that have been set. And then I can just switch to the replica set, etc. So you can see everything that you can see on the API. Usually, a lot of it, you can do it in the UI in there. The other thing that I wanted to just talk to you about briefly is another way of packaging applications with a bunch of Kubernetes-specific deployment descriptor is a tool called Helm. So it's very easy to install Helm on your local Kubernetes install. It's just you just need to install the Helm command line, and then you create a service account called Tiller. You give it enough access rights, and then you do a Helm init, and then you can start doing Helm install for different packages that have been packaged with that. Another one that I won't show you right now is Monocular, because this one takes a little bit more time. Monocular is a UI for Helm. You can install that locally on your machine as well. And one that I was, you can install Prometheus once you have Helm installed. So the one that I wanted to show you and that I couldn't make work, that's what I was struggling with before Chad started talking, is one that's super interesting that's called Squash. So Squash is a product, it's a project by Edith Levin. It's pretty well documented, but it's not very stable yet. And what it's doing is that it lets you attach a debugger to various Kubernetes pods running, or to containers inside of pods running in your Kubernetes cluster. So I successfully installed Squash. So you just install the Squash service in there. Then she has a VS Code extension to debug Go program that lets you attach to the Squash service to create a debug session with pods that contain Go programs. And it's pretty well documented, but just I couldn't make it work there. So I highly recommend that. And the other stuff that I've been playing with is, so I haven't played with that yet, is the whole service mesh. Service mesh are really fashionable right now. I want to play with them more on Docker EE as well as on localhost. They let you trace what happens, where the requests are coming through distributed code. And there are many of them. Istio is pretty fashionable right now. And then so the G2E lab, that's the equivalent of like doing modernization of a traditional G2E app in Docker files into Docker. And once you've containerized them, then you can deploy them on your Kubernetes cluster here. Contour is another service mesh that I wanted to play with. But basically, this is all the, like, I hope that gives you a good overview of all the things that you can do with Docker for Mac, Docker for Windows, and Kubernetes on your laptop, as well as Docker Enterprise Edition, which is still private beta with Kubernetes inside in production. Any questions? Sure.
What is this cube? How did you get Docker 18? I signed up for the beta for Kubernetes and got a message like either early January, late December, can't remember, saying, we're going to give beta to random people.
Oh, you didn't receive an email for Docker with Kubernetes inside?
I received an email that said there's too many people who signed up for the beta and not, you know, you didn't win.
Okay, so the beta is open to everybody now. If you go to Docker Store, just search for Docker for Mac. You end up in Docker Store.
Yeah, I mean, I have Docker installed and I checked for updates. And
so, but that's what I wanted to show you. You need to, in Docker Store, you need to go to the Edge release, which is different from so here, if you do get Docker, you'll get the stable version. What you want to do is to go below there, and there you say, I want Docker C for Mac Edge. And once you're on the Edge channel, you'll receive the Kubernetes update.
Okay,
so that's just a matter of downloading that, replacing your Docker with this, and it should just work.
All right, thanks.
I have a couple of questions. So first question, can you deploy with Docker stack, can you deploy on the remote Kubernetes clusters, your containers, or only to your local cluster?
So the Docker stack deploy integration with Kubernetes works with custom resource definitions for Kubernetes that are shipping. So these are the services that are running in Kubernetes by Docker that do that translation for you. So the client side talks to them and gives them the stack file, but then these resources are the ones who are doing the translation. These services are available in Docker for Mac, Docker for Windows, and Docker Enterprise Edition. So they're not available elsewhere today. So if you're a Docker Enterprise Edition customer, yeah, you can do that in a remote cluster. But else it's only on your laptop.
Okay, and second question, so is there any limitation to translating Docker Compose files to Kubernetes, like volumes, or like config maps, or like?
So that I don't know. I'm pretty sure when all this ships in generally available in GA, we'll have a documentation page explaining what is mapped and not mapped. For now, for example, I don't know if secrets are supported. Configs should translate to config maps. Secrets should translate to secrets, but I'm not sure if it's done or, yet. Volume, like the volume semantics in Kubernetes and in Docker are slightly different. So I don't know how the translation will happen. So we'll probably have more documentation on that when it's done.
Okay, and when is the release?
What did we say at DockerCon? I think we said Q2, so our first half of 2018, so it should be by June.
Okay, makes sense.
But you can play with it today and see what's implemented already. It's just a matter of experimenting. I don't think it's super well documented, that translation yet.
No, this is great. I mean, it's a great feature. I love this feature. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes your life much easier instead of having to write lots of YAML. Any other questions? All right, so I hope that will give you a desire to go download the Edge release of either Docker for Mac or Windows and maybe play with Docker beta. Thanks very much for coming.